This is the emergence of the United States as a world power, part 9, taking up where we left off. President McKinley has opted to send a treaty to the Senate where the United States will not only acquire Puerto Rico and Guam from Spain, and will also acquire the Philippines and will pay Spain $10 million, I believe it was, for that. Now, this was not the first time we'd done something like that. We took over about half of Mexico in 1849, and that for a price. What's now from the Rio Grande out to California, out to the West Coast actually. We're the first, and as far as I know, only conqueror in the history of the world to pay for a conquest after the fact. Okay, the treaty hit rough sledding in the Senate. Senate has to approve the treaty before we can go forward. And those who opposed it were varying, sometimes organized groups, sometimes just viewpoints. But what doomed their cause as much as anything was that these people are not friends with each other. They're far more accustomed to being political enemies than they are to being on the same side. It was an uncomfortable thing, trying to sleep in the same political bed with people who were usually your adversaries. Plus, you're asking to take the flag down from where it already flies. That just looks cowardly and un-American. So who is opposing this? Reminding you of what I said at the end of the last video, if you should ever encounter an essay question on an exam where you're called upon to state the isolationist, also the anti-imperialist case to answer the same thing, this is as close as we can come. Because whereas imperialists have been speculating out in space for years, they were just speculating. It wasn't a question on the table to be answered. Now there is. So your conservatives are, as we would say today, woke, and they're opposing this thing. Okay. I'm going to try to keep this in order of the supplement, so if I look away, that's what it is. Opposition came from fiscal conservatives. You are a fiscal conservative if you think that our government should keep tax rates relatively low, keep the national debt in check, that sort of thing. And fiscal conservatives could guess what was going to happen, and it did. We're going to keep the Philippines, and we're going to be very guilt-ridden about that. We're violating a very long-term stand against imperialism that's been with us from the beginning. So we're going to try to buy ourselves off by pouring shiploads of money into the Philippines, so we can tell ourselves we're not really doing this for ourselves, we're doing it for them. It's going to work for them. We're going to be building roads, bridges, hospitals, schools, public buildings, railroads, seaports, all that stuff. It's going to cost a ton of money. It's going to blow the budget sky high, and for that reason, fiscal conservatives opposed keeping the Philippines. Okay, that's an attitude, not an organization. Okay, another group that opposed this was organized labor. Labor unions opposed keeping the Philippines because labor unions, until not that long ago, probably less than 30 years, labor unions in this country took a very staunch anti-immigration or limited immigration stand because free immigration brings in a lot of people into the country who are going to compete for low-wage jobs. They're going to glut the labor market and drive wages down. And that's an unavoidable economic fact of life. So you can't daydream your way out of that. So organized labor, fearing that if we acquire the Philippines, then it will be too easy for vast numbers of Filipinos to move to the United States and compete in the job market, depressing wages. So labor unions opposed acquiring the Philippines. Okay, racists and people try to project upon 120 years ago attitudes of and about racism from today, and that's never good history. This is not anything active, it's an attitude. Not a very presentable one, but it's an attitude. But there were racists, and most everybody was to some extent. They thought we already have more people of color than we know what to do with. Now, let's please not open the door for 7 million more. All right, the Filipinos are regarded as people of color. I suppose, yes, they would qualify for that. So, people with racist attitudes, and I'm not going to sit here and tell you that they're the ultimate irredeemable evil. They're people with an attitude that we probably don't agree with. So they oppose that. And I keep having to look at this. Civil libertarians, all right? They're not organized either, but civil libertarians are people who become very militant about protecting people's civil rights, the rights that are embodied in the Bill of Rights and the Constitution, that sort of thing. They are opponents to government overreach and government overregulation. Civil libertarians. Liberals used to be that. I don't think they are anymore, but they need to get back to it. But here's the thing there. Civil libertarians were afraid, for good reason as it turned out, that the United States government, if it keeps the Philippines, will not extend civil rights to the people of that place. That they will not have the same rights as the people who live in territories not yet states, such as Arizona and maybe New Mexico and Oklahoma. The U.S., the only thing they couldn't do would be vote in federal elections. So, as it turned out, these fears were well founded. So you have that. You have foreign policy traditionalists. Again, this is far from being anything organized. It's an attitude, it's a set of beliefs. If we keep the Philippines, that would be a profound thing because we've always opposed imperialism in all its forms. We'd be switching sides just to be like the world, when some people had the idea that we should be different from the world. We should set the world an example, not be a copycat. So foreign policy traditionalists oppose this. There's one more thing, and I can't really tell you for sure if anybody saw this coming. Maybe a few did, but it'd be troubling if they did. If we keep the Philippines, we would be acquiring interests in a very remote from us and hard to understand part of the world. Okay? We would be acquiring interests that would be very, very difficult to protect. We would be potentially involving ourselves in the conflicts and the wars of a poorly understood part of the world so far from our homeland that we could make our weight felt there only with the most extreme exertion. It's just not a good idea. If we were in a classroom and I was at the front and you're sitting out there in your desks, I would ask you to picture a situation where you and I are sitting across a table from each other and you are insanely consumed with the desire to smash my fingers with your fist. But you can't do that because I'm sitting on my hands. You can't get to my fingers. But I just sort of zone out and forget what the deal is, and I start, counting the ceiling tiles, stick my hand out there on the table. Bop! You got me! Right? Keeping the Philippines is putting our hand on the table on the far end of the Pacific Ocean. Now, what did that lead to? I don't know if anybody saw this, was afraid of this or not. Sometimes nightmares come true, even if nobody had the nightmare. Do you know why Japan thought it was necessary to attack us in 1941 and drag us into World War II? You know why they did that? Because Japan had embarked on a merciless career of conquest in Asia in the early 1930s. They were like Hitler's Germany, Mussolini's Italy, only they're in Asia. Our administration, President Franklin Roosevelt, was informed that Japan has very few natural resources. They're getting their oil from us, They're getting vast amounts of scrap metal from us. We're supplying them with the materials to build their ships, tanks, planes, and guns, and supplying them with the fuel to run them on. So President Roosevelt embargoed that stuff. That is, we will not sell you this stuff anymore. Took some law changes to make that come true. So the Japanese leaders have got about 6 months before they're going to run out of gas. They have to either get us to come around or acquire new supplies of ores and petroleum. They knew where to find them. They're in Malaysia, places like that, south of the Philippine Islands. So an American possession is right square dab in between Japan and the mineral-rich or rich area they need to conquer. So to continue the war, since we're not going to play ball with them, they're going to have that. So they're going to have to fight the United States. Truth to tell, they weren't afraid of us. And when we get all peacenik about it, people aren't afraid of us, and they need to be. We're better that they're afraid of us than not, because we're more likely to get in trouble if they're not. So as I will tell you again when we're setting up World War II, Japan's going to take on the United States, and the man planning their war effort had no illusions. He knew more about the United States. They're going to win this thing. They're going to win it on one day. They're going to win it all of a sudden and get it done so that we will have no choice but to retire and let them do what they want. That's what this did to us, acquiring the Philippines. Now, eventually, we granted the Philippines their full independence on July 4th, gee, what a coincidence, 1946. But along the way, we had to reconquer the Philippines from the Japanese at great cost in blood. Okay, so the treaty was ratified. We acquired the Philippine Islands. Okay, in the supplements, I need you to take it from there. You know what? I'm not quite through the Philippines. I will do this. Filipino people and leaders they were totally shocked when they found that we had not liberated them. We were going to replace the Spanish as their new colonial masters. So we're about to get a swift and brutal lesson of the true cost of the road we have taken. The Filipinos rebelled against us. Talk about casting against type. We are in the unfamiliar position of having to quell an anti-imperialist rebellion. So, you got two wars that happened within a 4-year time span. Spanish-American War and the Philippine War, sometimes called the Filipino Insurrection. Spanish-American War, less than 500 casualties. The Philippine War, 3,600 casualties. Spanish-American War over in 4 months. The Philippine War, 3 years. And we used the same tactics the Spanish had used in Cuba that we got so angry about. Okay, we were able to quell that rebellion after we captured their leader, a half Japanese, half Filipino leader named Emilio Aguinaldo, who lived till 1964 and became a communist. But that plus just pouring money on the Philippines calmed things down. So that's what this is going to be about. Okay, I'm going to punt the rest of this to the supplements, and I will have to check the page numbers. Give me a second here. 59 onto the end of that chapter. I could tell you about this, but I usually don't have time for it in class, so I'm not going to do it here. But read the rest of that chapter. Secretary of State John Hay's open door to China policy. President Theodore Roosevelt, who was he, had to get to be president, and his nationalism and all of that. So this will do it for this one.